I'll skip the introduction, but maybe you've played these games before where you have a series and you have to determine the odd one out. So I'm going to sort of take the answer before you start guessing. I'm the odd one out on this panel because actually I deal with what happens when security has failed. So our work starts on the what is commonly called the repression side, when prevention hasn't been perfect and when we have to deal with the consequences, when we have to make sure that whoever has infringed the prevention measures successfully actually doesn't do so with impunity, which unfortunately today is still often the case. Now, as Liz already mentioned, I'm not a finance expert. The work that we do focuses on creating the right framework for the fight against cybercrime through policy, coordination, and funding. Now, there's always a balance to be struck between security and convenience. Perfect security, as you're well aware, may be perfectly inconvenient for your client. Plus, oftentimes, crime is not a question of your own security. It may be the security of somebody else. It may be the security measures of a retailer who your customer has stored their payment card data with, just to give you one example. Or it might be the security of your very own customer who falls for a phishing attack or another social engineering attack. So there's always the human factor, even if you had perfect technological security measures, which means that we cannot eliminate crime. So I want to take the next 3 minutes to tell you about three things. I want to tell you about some of the challenges that we face in creating a more effective law enforcement response to cybercrime, about some of the already existing responses to the challenges that we face, and about what else is needed. Now, Liz has asked me also to tell some war stories, so I'm going to illustrate this with a few of our recent cases that we've come across. It's no secret that the financial sector has become a key target for cybercrime, really the key target. Just to name a few threats that you currently face, it's distributed denial of service attacks, so we find that banks are actually being held ransom. They're being blackmailed with the threat of takedown of their online presence for a few hours or even longer, and are being asked for money in exchange for that not happening. We see something called ATM jackpotting, where ATMs in certain member states are actually being manipulated with code to basically like a cash machine or like a gambling machine in a casino to just spew out their entire holdings of cash without any control. We see a lot of online banking fraud and payment card fraud. And what we also see as a worrying increasing phenomenon is the prevalence of carding sites. So carding sites are sites where people basically trade payment card credentials. What happens in practice is that frequently you have a retailer hack, just such as Target, for example, where a lot of customer records are stolen, and then just an hour later, those records will actually hit one of those carding sites and be sold in bundles or individually. They will be grouped by corporate credit cards, personal credit cards, to make sure that those records that are less likely to be checked are actually sold for more money. And then you have all sorts of excellent mechanisms. I was just looking this up yesterday. So you have trusted sellers, you have feedback mechanisms, you can report abuse to the site managers of a carding site. So if the credit cards that you bought were older than they were made out to be or were already blocked, then you can complain, and the seller might lose his trusted seller credentials. So really we have a whole dark side of the economy that is functioning extremely well, and we basically have to make sure that we catch up. Because we face a number of hurdles that the dark economy does not face. When you look at cybercrimes, you very rarely have a national context. You're always dealing with transnational activity, which means that we have to get police across several states to cooperate. We have evidence that's spread out over several jurisdictions. We have victims in several jurisdictions, and we usually also have banks, retailers, and other involved parties across different sectors and jurisdictions. You also have the added problem that crime as a service means that you no longer have to really have a lot of skills to go out and steal anyone's credentials or use them. So you have situations where you or I could go and basically rent space or time on a botnet, on a network of computers, harness their processing power, and then drive a DDoS attack against a bank to take down their site. It doesn't take very much money, and it certainly doesn't take any technical skills. So now that I've told you all about the terrible challenges that we face, let me tell you about one very successful recent operation that I want to share with you to show you that not all is bad. We can make progress. And this was the Airline Fraud Action Day that was recently coordinated by Europol in November of last year. So airline fraud, or as we call it, is basically a situation where you have stolen carding credentials used to purchase last-minute flights. It's a really extremely attractive product for criminals because the delivery is almost instantaneous. You can use the credentials, you can use the tickets within 2 hours, and when a few days or weeks later the MasterCard or Visa or American Express tells you that this card actually had been stolen, the credentials had been stolen, it's a bit too late. The flight has already gone, the person has disappeared, and this is something that is causing a loss to the airline industry and the financial sector in the millions, in the hundreds of millions of euros each year. So what Europol and police agencies in 32 countries around the globe did was they joined forces for a day with the payment sector industry and with IATA. So they sat in, I think, 109 airports across the world. They basically had a law enforcement official, a prosecutor, somebody from the payment cards industry, and somebody from the airline. And they were checking each and every transaction as it was being conducted. And as soon as there was a suspicion of potential fraud, they would call the bank. The payment card issuer would call the bank and basically get in touch with the bank to see whether this fit the normal behavior of this customer, whether there were any ways to basically firm up the suspicion. And then if there were such ways, the persons who were trying to travel on those tickets were apprehended and were basically asked a few questions about who they really were, and their papers were checked. And in this way, we had something like 330 persons apprehended during that day at 109 airports. Some of them were also arrested and kept. And very importantly, what this showed was that this type of fraud is a facilitator for very serious organized crime. So a number of the people who were apprehended were actually engaging in drug smuggling, in trafficking of human beings for purposes of sexual exploitation, or in other very serious forms of crime. So again, if you follow the money, you were frequently led to other forms of crime that may be even more serious. So what are the key elements that worked here? Basically, there are three. You need a sound and clear legal framework. You need excellent cooperation. And you need funding to have the right tools and training. So I just want to go through very quickly what we have in place in those three areas and what else is missing. And maybe also where you can come in to help fix what's missing. Now, for the legal framework, from my perspective, we need to agree on what's criminalized and then how we deal with it, how we prioritize it. What we already have in place, you've heard about the prevention side, but for criminal law, we have a directive on attacks against information systems that basically harmonizes offenses against the infrastructure across the EU to a certain extent. So we've agreed to criminalize, for example, the creation and the use of botnets, or the hacking into systems, or the interception of information as it is being routed. So that's really your infrastructure attacks that are at the base of cybercrime. We also have an old framework decision on fraud and counterfeiting of non-cash means of payment, and that is something that is, I'm afraid, very outdated and that we're currently working on revising. So there, basically, there are certain things that are not covered, such as, to give you an example, the framework decision still focuses on the physical card. So it covers the case of skimming, where somebody's data is taken and then you create a new plastic card and use that. But what it does not cover is when you use those credentials and go online to buy services, when you're just using the data. What's also not covered is the trade in this data. So if you cannot prove the connection to the theft of the data, but you later find the records online, the trade in data as a virtual object is not yet covered by many criminal laws of the member states. So there, we need to clearly shape up. And in this process of devising new legislation, obviously we're going to have a period of public consultation, and I would be extremely interested in your input, where you see the problems, what you see as the main issues in terms of the criminal legislation here. So I would really invite you to get in touch with us. Excuse me. Now, the second point on cooperation. You saw that we have some efforts in place. We notably have the European Cybercrime Center, which coordinates law enforcement efforts upon request among the member states. Also creates a link to third countries. And it has, importantly, also a link to the financial sector. So some of you may be a member of the European Financial Coalition at the European Cybercrime Center, or maybe a member of its advisory group on financial services. We also have at national level several very successful public-private partnerships in some of the member states where banks and law enforcement and computer emergency response teams share and exchange information and intelligence, and sometimes already have started to build cases in the national system against certain major threats. That is extremely helpful. We very clearly need to expand this further because we see the benefits of these once-off actions as the Airline Action Day, but you have to be conscious that other than on those 2 days in November, the rest of the year, 363 days, nobody was catching these transactions in time, and everybody who was apprehended that day went through pretty much unharmed the other day. So we clearly need to step up our act here. Our role as a commission can be to facilitate this with funding for public-private partnerships, and also by helping to create the right legal framework and helping participants navigate it. So obviously in these public-private partnerships, we have to deal with the requirements that stem from banking regulations, from competition rules, from data protection rules, and from other legislative frameworks. On the police side, we have to deal with the fact that many member states have an obligation for the police to act on every piece of information if it can raise suspicion of a crime, and that makes it very difficult for the financial sector sometimes to share information, because the police might not be able to just say, okay, I will take this for my background knowledge only. They might be forced to say, oh, okay, well, I have to go out and deal with this right now, which might not be in the interest of the bank at that moment. So clearly there's room for improvement, but I would also ask for your involvement. We can do a certain amount in terms of funding these public-private partnerships, helping to set them up, but it is really you, the financial sector, who has to be the partner on the other side, the active partner, and get involved. And I'm very grateful to a large number of you that are already involved via Europol and other such efforts, and I would invite you to keep investing and also to tell us what the obstacles are for you that we might be able to tackle. And then just finally on the third point, funding for the right tools and training, we're very conscious that we also need to establish law enforcement as a credible partner in this effort. So I can imagine that a lot of you have made the experience, or at least some of you will have made the experience, that when you try to report a cybercrime, your normal police officer may not be able to really understand the full details, or may not be at the technical level of your own cybersecurity people in your bank, for example. And that is something where we have to work very hard to basically make every police person a competent first responder on a site that has to do with an e-crime, and to have a set of skilled police officers who can really deal with the complexities of a cybercrime investigation involving multiple jurisdictions and very complicated financial and cyber systems. So that's something where we have already funded the creation of a number of courses, and where we keep funding trainings to make sure that we can help upskill the law enforcement in the EU. Now, just to conclude, I mean, these were just a few of the elements that we have in place and that we need when it comes to the legal framework, to coordination, and to tools and training. Clearly, a lot more is needed, and I would really welcome your input on where you see the big gaps and maybe what we are also missing in terms of the priorities that I've just set out. And I would very much invite you to contribute, in particular, to our process now in terms of devising new rules for criminalizing the fraud and counterfeiting of non-cash means of payment. Thank you very much.